The good folks at Comics for Fun and Profit have been doing 2 episodes a week for quite some time now, and it's all thanks to, first of all, Jason, and second of all, our patrons who allow us to add the space on our server, broadcast more, store more, share more with you, the listeners. I'm envious of those of you who have unlimited storage and media server capabilities. We pay for ours here at the C4 FAP. It ain't cheap. We thank you so much for those of you who go to patreon.com/comicsfunprofit and contribute at any level to say thanks, to say, I want to be a part of your Slack channel conversations. I want to get exclusives. I want to get early access. I want to get ad-free access. I want to get swag. I want to get some free stuff. Whatever your reasoning is, we appreciate it at any level because it does make a difference. So from the bottom of Kyle and I and Jason's heart, thank you for contributing.
Aloha! This is Jason from Hawaii. Welcome to a special edition of the Comics for Fun and Profit podcast. In this episode, I will be interviewing Josh Stafford and Eric Larson. Now, Josh and Eric are here to talk about the 90th anniversary of the Mayfair Theater. Now, this is, when I heard about this theater, this is a historical, magical theater that is located in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. And it was built in 1932. Now, I know listeners, you guys are going to go, okay, so how does this sort of relate to comics? Well, I interviewed Josh last year with his writing partner, Howard Wong, as they talked about Damn Cursed Children from Source Point Press. And if you have not picked up that trade, that is an awesome comic book series. Now, during that interview, Josh mentioned that the Mayfair Theater was going to be celebrating its 90th anniversary, and I thought it'd be great to have him and his friend Eric to come back on the show to celebrate this historic event. Josh and Eric also have a podcast, the Mayfair Theater Podcast, where they talk about upcoming movie schedules, events for the theaters, pop culture stuff, and their love for movies. Josh and Eric, welcome to Comics for Fun and Profit. How are you guys doing today?
Great. Thanks, Jason. Nice to be back.
Yeah, fantastic. Really glad to be on the show.
Oh, thank you very much. Okay. So now, where can listeners follow either one, like you or Josh or Eric, where can listeners follow you on social media?
I am very bad at my personal social media. And somebody said this recently. He said, if you do social media for a living at all, you totally stop doing your own social media because you run out of steam. Mm-hmm. So between a very full year of plugging the comic book, and then I kind of mostly handle the Twitter, Facebook, Instagram for the Mayfair, I do very little personal social media, but you can find me very easily. I'm always updating at Mayfair Theater on Twitter. Yes. And Instagram, just with Mayfair-related stuff. And if you're looking for me, just find Mayfair Theater on Facebook, and I'm always on there talking with folks about movies that we have coming up.
That takes all your time and patience, basically. But I make up for that by, I do all the other stuff for my personal site. So my Twitter and Instagram handle is at Lazron, Lazron. Mm-hmm. But I also do music on the side at reverbnation.com/LARSIN. So, and I've actually gotten to do a couple of musical bits for Mayfair projects, just kind of silly fun, but just, it's nice when something like that comes up and you're like, oh, hey, I can do this and make people smile,
Mm-hmm. That's great. Listeners, you guys are in for a treat. I told Josh, and we're here to celebrate the 90th anniversary in the Mayfair Theater and our love for movies. I also told Josh and Eric, please, if I ask them a question, if they kind of go off tangent on certain movie scenes, it's to celebrate movies, and I told them it's okay, they can do that. Also, to Josh and Eric, I forgot to mention to you in the before we started the interview, I'll ask when I give questions, I'll probably point to maybe Josh, why don't you answer first, or Eric, why don't you answer first? Kind of sort of try to keep things in order, but if you guys just jump in ahead of time, that's fine too. It's to celebrate movies. All right. So I'm going to start off with Josh first. Josh, where did you grow up?
So I was born in a small, lovely town called Chaville, Quebec, which is, what is it, about 90 minutes outside of Ottawa,
Mm-hmm.
and just truly like a great little one-horse town with a library and an ice cream shop and a summer fair and that kind of stuff. I still have family around there, but I've lived most of my life in Ottawa. Moved here, I think, when I was around 4 or 5 years old. So yeah, so I've been in Ottawa my whole life after that.
Okay. And then Eric, what about you?
Well, I also grew up in a small town, but in northern Ontario, called Parry Sound. And we actually lived 30 minutes outside of that, even further in the middle of nowhere, basically. But my family ran like a small cottage campground resort year round. So we were actually like 30 minutes away from pretty much everybody, but including our local theater, which actually is currently up for sale. So that's kind of funny. Makes me sort of feel a little old, I guess. But I moved to Ottawa.
I'm trying to peer pressure Eric into buying it.
Yeah, he's been leaning on me. I'm like, in a different lifetime, in like a Everything Everywhere All at Once timeline, I probably ran that theater. But for now, it's like I moved to Ottawa in 2001.
Mm-hmm.
And so like that kind of became my new home. And I haven't been back to Parry Sound since, but no offense to them. It's still a great town. I'm here now.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, Eric, I'm going to ask, what was your very first movie that you saw in the theater?
Oh man. Well, it was funny. I was thinking about this, and I remember like the first one that I saw like when I was a kid in that theater was, I'm pretty sure it was The Fox and the Hound. It was like a re-release of the Disney movie. I remember that pretty vividly because there was a couple scary scenes for a 3 or 4 year old or whatever I was at the time. But I was thinking about that for the Mayfair because, as I said, I moved here in 2001, and so it would have been late 2001, early 2002. And Josh and I talked about what movies came out around there. But the thing is, like, it wouldn't have been a movie from that time period because we play kind of stuff from everywhere, you know? So
Yes.
the more I thought about it, I actually moved to Ottawa to attend film school. And so I obviously was big into that and
Yes.
you know, genre stuff, you know. So to my best, like, guess would be it would be some sort of classic, probably zombie or creep show. Because like that was the thing that just caught my eye. Like the Mayfair is just up the street from the Carleton University where I was attending, and so I remember the first time I found out that was a thing, I was like, "Oh my god! Like this is my new fortress of solitude." So yeah, a great start there. I'll tell you that.
So I'm just going to ask, when you mentioned Zombie, what the movie Zombie, was it from that Italian director from, it was the one made in the 1970s?
Yeah, Lucio Fulci from '79.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's so like I mean, it's not for everyone, obviously, but you know, it's definitely you know that an eye-catching, eye-popping type of movie, for lack of a better term.
It's the AKA zombie fights a shark.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. That's how we remember. We're like, oh, the Microsoft ad that for some reason had a scene from it. Yeah.
But I'm going to say, because I remember, sorry Josh, because I remember finally watching that movie, came on Flicks, the channel, and it was kind of like, because I remember for years, it was like banned in certain countries, you know, because of the quote unquote the graphic nature of the movie, you know. But I remember, and I finally watched it, and now don't take offense, because if you love the movie, that's great. But for me, when I finally saw it like 2 years ago, everything had changed. You know what I'm saying? The graphic
definitely.
violence has been ramped up so much. Like Zack Snyder's you know, Dawn of the Dead. It was like, oh my god, or even The Walking Dead. Just watching Zombie, it was like, okay, but I could see how it could be very graphic violence back in the 70s. Yeah,
For sure, yeah, because like the sadness or Train to Busan, like there's so much stuff that's way more intense now. But there's something about like that kind of, you know, there's really only 2 or 3 key scenes that are kind of horrific or whatever. The rest of it is just kind of a vibe. But that's kind of why it's cool. Like it's a very unique looking movie, and it was kind of replicated a little bit by The Dead. There was 2 movies called The Dead 2, and they kind of had a similar looking zombie. And I thought that was cool. Like it was very Fulci-esque, but also had cool cinematography. So it's like, it's interesting to see the influence that continues to have.
yeah. Okay, so now Josh, what about you? What was your first movie that you saw in the theater?
My first Mayfair movie was my cool uncle who would bring me to movies all the time. We went to see a Monty Python double bill. and it was, and now for something completely different. And I'm pretty sure Holy Grail, I think, but it was 2 Monty Python movies, and Monty Python's not too racy or controversial, but when you're 11 or 12 and going with your cool uncle, that's a cool night at the movies. And so I always remember that. And then going on my own a few years later, a friend and my friend lived right near the Mayfair, and in grade 9 we went to see a double bill of Sign of the Times, Prince's Sign of the Times, which is the one we were going to because we were little Prince fans because he did Batman, and as far as we knew, that was where Prince started his career.
Yeah.
But it was double billed with, because Mayfair always had these nonsensical double bills because it would just be like 2 distributors lining up. So it was Sign of the Times and Tommy. And so it was 2 musicals, but Tommy is out there for a little kid to be watching. So those are my first 2 double bills at the Mayfair were Monty Python and Prince and Tommy.
Oh my God! Because I'm kind of going off the cuff, but I mean, for younger listeners, I mean, I remember, going to double features where you just pay 1 ticket price to see 2 movies. Now it's like you can't do that anymore.
No, and that's both because seemingly people don't have the attention span, despite them saying they want to see it or requesting it. We did double bills in our early days, 12, 13 years ago, and they just kind of died out. Like you would have 200 people there for the first show and 15 for the second show. And that combined with distributors don't like each other. So, for example, you couldn't play, X-Men, a Fox film, and Spider-Man, a Sony film. Like, you couldn't do that.
Yeah.
So that makes things difficult. So we've been single screenings for quite some time. And when you're a single screen, it's easier because then you could put a grown-up movie on at 7 o'clock and a crazy horror movie on at 9 o'clock and get 2 different audiences there.
Yeah. But I'm also wondering, too, if it's just also the changing times, too, because like you said, when you guys did the double bills, years ago, slowly things were like, oh God, I got to get home to do this. I want to go see it. It's like being like a little kid again. I want to see 2 films. And then I'm sure they probably go, oh crap, I got to go home. I have to do this. Or, oh shoot, some TV shows on at 9 o'clock. I need to be home to watch that instead. So other things are probably drawing it away too, as well.
I think it's just, my generation of nerd has all gotten older and are grown-ups with kids or jobs, or they have to be up in the morning, or so they might be able to do 1 movie, but doing 2, that's a bigger commitment.
Yeah. And then also too, like you said too, because also too, it's also to maybe our attention span too. Because I'm going to be honest, because I'm kind of going off the cuff here, but just like when I read certain books, if the novel's too long, I stop in the middle, put it down. Whereas recently I was reading this Marvel prose novel done by Aconite. The chapters are like at least 8 to 10 pages, and I can read the complete chapter. And then, I can go on to the next chapter and then just stop. But if a chapter is like 20 pages, like, oh, this is like dredging,
Yeah, my wife's reading a book right now where she said the chapters are like 2 pages each. But I was like, how many chapters are there? Is there like 70 chapters?
Yeah. All right. Sorry. I'm going to continue on. So, Josh, I'm going to ask you this question. What is like some of your favorite movies when you're growing? What are some of your favorite movies right now that you love? Well, not right now, but what are some of your favorite movies that you like? And why?
It's so tough because Eric and I have joked, we tease each other that we would be the worst Siskel and Ebert because we just like everything.
Yeah.
we like everything. So I'm bad at making lists. I'm bad at that kind of thing because my list would be 500 movies. But I always just kind of, if riffing off the top of my head for like Lifetime stuff, I love American Graffiti a lot. Just the simplicity of that movie, and the music's great, and it's just like a great little indie movie. It shows you what might have happened to George if Star Wars had flopped. Maybe he just would have done a bunch more character pieces like that. But yeah, I love that. I love George Romero. I love Sam Raimi.
Yes.
I
You got
like
a Ghostbusters tattoo. Come on.
Oh yeah, Ghostbusters. Yeah, I'm very much a child of the '80s. So what's funny is they might not be good, but I love so many 1980s movies that are giant flops. So whether that's Tron and Willow and Labyrinth and The Last Starfighter, like it's just, all those '80s movies, I just
Yes.
The
really
Wizard.
love. Krull,
Oh
like
my God. The
so
Wizard.
like not good per se, but I love them.
Hmm.
And yeah, so it's like, but when I think of the movie I may have watched the most and never get tired of, it might be Army of Darkness. Every time I watch it, I'm still laughing and I'm still in love with Bruce, and I still like. We screened all 3 movies last Halloween,
Nice.
and they're all great. But something about Army of Darkness, which some people don't like because it's the least horror of the 3, but I'm all in. I love that movie.
Oh my God. All right, Eric, what about you?
Oh man, it's like, and I was talking to Josh before about this, where I was just like, 2 of the worst questions are like, what are your favorite movies and what would you recommend lately? I mean, they're the best questions, but they're also the hardest because I'm like, I don't have 4 hours. Actually, I do, but you don't have 4 hours right now. But anyways, so like, I love pretty much all the genres of film, but like, I'm a huge horror fan, obviously, and so my favorite is actually Creepshow. And I'm just like, I'm a huge fan of horror anthologies and 50s horror comics and stuff, but just like the mix of like the cast and the music and the color and the effects, obviously it's just such a potent blend, and it really like captures that EC Comics feel that they were going for, and that really hasn't been, I mean, like the original Tales from the Crypt movie and the series obviously are amazing, but you almost, it's a bit of a lost art these days, and I don't know if that's just because like modern horror has taken over or whatnot, but I mean, they were doing like, there was a great series a while back that was like 50s horror reprint, haunted horror, that they were doing reprints of that a few years ago, and I was collecting all of the, like, I hadn't really bought new comics in a while, and ironically those aren't new comics, they're just like repackages, but but I love that feel and like that old sort of style of storytelling. So like that one, that's my favorite horror movie all in. But another one I love is Edward Scissorhands, which is just such the blend of like gothic wonder and like kind of the whimsy, but also like just like Tim Burton just had such, I mean, I'm not going to co-sign all of the stuff that he made later on. Not that I hate any of it, but it's just his early stuff, was just had this sort of nightmarish heart that was, kind of creepy, but also funny. And like, you really get to know the characters, and like, that's such a heartbreaking movie, but so great. And then finally, like the other one I thought of was the 1966 Batman movie. Because I mean, as a kid, like I love that show. I mean, it's even still now, like I love that show.
Yes.
And it's just the heart and the silliness, and of course, like Adam West. It's really indescribable. But like that movie did such a good job of capturing a TV show, like the best of what that show was. Which is really hard to replicate. And finally, I'm a huge Nicolas Cage fan. So I mean, pretty much every Nicolas Cage film as well.
So Eric, before I continue, I'm going off the cuff here because I know you said that you love those EC pre-code comic books. I'm just asking, have you checked out Josh is from Source Point Press? Josh Warner presents Classic Pulp.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah, because Josh Warner is the editor-in-chief at Source Point Press, and Josh, help me out on this if I missed something, but Josh Warner, basically he'll find these old pre-code comics, and he'll try to, as much as he can, digitally remaster it. He'll put it out in single issues. I think there's like 3 or 4 stories or something. But the thing is, the sad thing is there is no creator credit in the story. And then I think usually in the last page he'll write, hey, if you're reading this, if you know who did this, please let me know so we can give them credit or something.
Oh, awesome.
And then I think already there's been 2 trades out of, I think one was crime and ghost stories, and the other one was like classic robots. And we're talking about like pre-code, I think like from the late 30s, early 40s. So if you get a chance, check it out.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. No, that's right up my alley. Like pretty much, you had me pretty much instantly with the start of that sentence. So I'm definitely gonna check that out.
Yeah. So, all right. So, okay, guys, we're we're getting to the meat of this, the Mayfair Theater. So, Eric, I'm going to ask you this question. So I'm going to ask, basically, I'm just going to ask you the simplest question. If you could just tell us what the address is, the hours of operation, and Josh already told us about the social media, but yeah, where's the theater located? The Mayfair Theater.
So we're at 1074 Bank Street, which took me years to remember, even though I was going there pretty much every day. but yeah, like when we're in a really nice block, there's a block or two of really cool shops, like a cool bookstore and like a pinball arcade and like pizza place. So it's like I feel like we spearhead that neighborhood, but it's really blown up in the last couple of years with some very cool shops. But usually the hours are about like roughly 3 to 10. We do 3 shows a day. And there's a midnight movie the last Saturday of the month, but we've been doing like 2 per month for June to August just to try something else, and it's been doing pretty well. So hopefully we'll bring that back. And the prices didn't change for a long time for snacks and for admission. That was one of the cool things about us was just it's always been an affordable, cool place. But the prices went up slightly a few years ago, and predictably nobody cared. Everyone was very supportive of it. Like, we've got a really good fan base, but it's just $7 for kids, $8 for members, $9 for seniors, and $12.50 for non-members, which is still cheaper than the average movie that you would go to. And then membership is only $14 for the year, so it literally pays for itself if you go to like 2 movies.
That's great.
Yeah,
that is really great. Now, Josh, I'm going to start with you, and then Eric, if you guys, and either one of you guys, if you guys want to jump in and add. So I'm going to ask you, what is the amazing history of the Mayfair Theater? So
the Mayfair is sadly one of the last of its kind. You know, once upon a time, not just big cities like New York, Chicago, Toronto, whatever, every city had a little movie theater.
Yes.
The smallest little city would have a movie theater. Little towns have a movie theater. And over the years, and it's not a singular fault. Like it's not TV's fault. It's not video stores' fault. It's not video games' fault. Just the world has changed over the decades. And so now, Ottawa's lucky that we have 2 single-screen cinemas left. But even going back a couple decades, like when I was in high school, there's at least 8 or 10 cinemas, even like kind of multiplex cinemas, that are not there anymore.
Yes.
So we're hanging in there. We're really an anomaly. And so we were built in 1932. My favorite thing about that is we were built in the Great Depression. I don't know why somebody built a movie theater in the Great Depression. You think they would have better things to do, you know? But, so yeah, 1932. And just, there's like some bullet points that I know just from doing interviews. And I don't necessarily know what this means, but I know that we are a Spanish villa style Mediterranean architecture. And I think what that means is when you look at the interior of the cinema, we've got these fake balconies and kind of this filigree around the screen, fake stained glass windows and kind of tiles and stuff. So I think all that adds up to this Spanish villa style that they used in 1932. So all of that helped us get heritage status back in 2008, which helped keep the cinema up and not be torn down and turned into Shoppers Drug Mart, which is a chain, a nationwide Canadian drugstore chain. So instead now they built right next door to us, and that's where we buy our butter from. But the plan was to tear down the Mayfair and have it turned into a store.
I'm going to ask Eric, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, like, I mean, I feel like I hogged the last question, and then he totally just killed that last one. So, I mean, there's little I could add to that, but just to say that, like, it really is like a time capsule walking in there, and so little has changed apart from adding cool props like a carbonite Han Solo and stuff like that, you know. So, which it feels like it's been there since 1932, but it's, you know, obviously hasn't. But it's pretty amazing just how well the building is held up, and I'm sure a lot of that is to do with us and just the amount of love that we put into that place.
And then before I continue on, it's either one of you guys could answer this question, but now when I did some research, Now there is something. It said something in my research. It said something about it's the last remaining auditorium clock in Ottawa. Do you guys know what that is? Or
Yeah,
stands?
that's so weird because the clock does not. When I look at the clock, the auditorium clock, it's kind of neon-y, and I think it looks like 1970s.
Yeah.
But it is from 1932, and this
Wow.
clock has been up in the cinema since 1932. And there's a family that ran the theater from the 30s to the 70s,
Hmm.
and I really don't know much. It's so funny. There's not a ton of history, but the Robertson family owned it for all those years, and we still have, which I love, some old timers who come in and were kids in the 40s or whatever,
Oh my
and
God.
have stories about that clock and all the most kind of cliche cinema going stories of our parents would drop us off and they'd give us a quarter
Hmm.
and we would go to a triple bill, and Ms. Robertson would keep the kids. And you imagine back then, so currently we have 325 seats.
Mhm.
Back then it was 600 seats.
Oh God.
And I wouldn't be surprised if there was 500 8-year-olds in there.
Yes.
And back then, they would drop them off, and then mom and dad would, go to the hair salon or go buy groceries or
Yeah.
do whatever. And can you imagine 500 kids being dropped off for a triple bill on a Sunday afternoon? So she would essentially be like, if you don't all shut up, we're turning off the movie. And the kids would behave. And so there's still people around who have memories of that family running the place way back then. But yeah, so anyhow, so that clock is it's a clock in the cinema, which it's a compliment to the movie. Is most of the time I don't notice it.
Mhm.
But then every once in a while, if it's like a bad movie or if you'll look up and you'll see like oh, we have half an hour left or whatever. But yeah, so it's this vintage piece of equipment that's been there for 90 years.
It's pretty calming too, I find. Like sometimes just during a movie I might just glance over at it and it's just like I don't know, it's weird to describe, but it's just kind of like a nice like calming color, and I'm just, even though it's a clock, and there have been people who've complained, they're just like, oh, why would you have a clock in a theater? But I'm just like Josh says, you don't notice it. Like you're watching a movie, like you're not just like, oh geez, look at all this architecture in the way, like it's just
Yeah.
like a nice thing to have there, I feel like.
Oh my God. But Josh, like you mentioned, it's because I mean nowadays most parents cannot just drop their 8-year-old kid off at a movie theater now.
Yeah, the good old days were crazy.
Yeah.
The good old days. I don't know how anyone got out of there alive because like, even I have to double check with my mom because my mom, when she was a kid, lived in Scarborough, Ontario, and Montreal, Quebec. Before, I think, as a youth or teenager, moving into Ottawa, and in my family lived there all that time. But she has a story of, she wasn't part of this, but it was in the neighborhood. There was a theater just like the Mayfair, and on a Sunday afternoon, they had, luckily nothing happened with this, but they had a fire.
Oh God.
I don't know if it was like a popcorn fire or what, but they had a fire. And it was when there was 500 kids there on a Sunday afternoon, before the days of cell phones, before the days of anything. So parents left their kids there for a double bill and came back to get them at, whatever, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock. And as they approach the theater, all they see is smoke and a bunch of fire trucks and hundreds of kids littering the streets. And after that, I think it was Montreal. After that, Montreal went, yeah, okay, parents, you can't do that anymore. Yeah, it's too dangerous. But yeah, like, 'cause I can't imagine now, like, yeah, like an 8-year-old just being dropped off. If the parent was like, oh, I'm just dropping the kid off, I'll be back, I'd be like, yeah, I don't think that's allowed anymore.
Yeah, you're not Mrs. Robertson or whoever to watch after all those kids.
I'm sorry, this isn't the 70s, right?
Yeah.
It feels like it sometimes, but no.
All right. So these next questions, whoever wants to answer it first, or even add anything, that's fine too. Now, I'm gonna ask a very dumb question. Do you guys use both? Now, does the theater use both a regular film and a digital projector, or which projector do you guys use now currently?
So, like 90, I was going to say 90, but for real, it might be 99% of the time we use digital. But what we were lucky with is many a cinema, when the big switchover happened, had to toss their 35 millimeter projector to put in the digital projector. For whatever reason, we have a very big projection room. And so we have our two 35 millimeter projectors, and then what we tossed aside was our 16 millimeter projector. So in that third window, that's what almost every movie is projected through, digital. But every so often, I can't even think of the last one, but it's really like once or twice a year, we'll screen something on film just for a special occasion, whether it be a mini film festival or something like that. The harsh reality is, as much fun as film is, it's so much easier and usually better quality, controversially, to go digital, because it's funny, like Eric mentioned Batman 66, and I guess it might have been for the 50th anniversary, we screened Batman 66 on film, which is super fun, and because you think that, you know, a physical thing has a life. So this film was around in the 60s, was around in the 70s. But the poor thing was so beat up, and it was missing scenes, and it was scratched up, and the color was muted, and some of it was comical, and luckily it was a good crowd. But like Batman and Robin hit the bat pole, and instead of going down it, it just jumped 8 seconds, and then like, so you were missing dialogue. But it was fine. It's fun. It's kind of it's retro. It feels like you're at an old drive-in or something.
Yes.
But a couple years later, so I think that was for that, and then in '89. For Batman's 80th birthday, we screened it again, but on a digital restoration. And it blew my mind. Like, the color was so sharp, and the sound and music was so good, and no scenes were missing. And it just makes you go like, okay, you know, cinema hipster fans, like, I get it. I know film is cool, but it's hard to argue that digital is the way to go now.
Yeah.
But we can still have fun and play on film every once in a while, but really it's mostly digital nowadays.
Yeah, it's cool to have the capability, I find. I didn't realize we had the capability of 16 millimeter and 35 and digital. You know, I guess not all at once, but it is like we've talked about that before too. Because one of the ones I remember was a double bill of Texas Chainsaw Massacre 1 and 2, and we did Psycho 1 and 2, and I love all 4 of those movies. But it was interesting seeing Texas Chainsaw because the second one actually looked pretty good because it was newer, obviously. But seeing the original, I remember Lee saying it was the X-rated cut. And I was like, oh, yeah, we're getting to see this X-rated cut. And it was basically red. Yes. And not just with blood. Like, it was, like, colored red by the you know, I don't know if it was the onset of vinegar syndrome or whatever. But, and it just, you know, it wasn't like I was dissatisfied. It was still very cool to see. Yes. But Josh and I talk all the time about that, where you're just like, it's kind of like the unspoken thing where you're just supposed to be like film, you know, like down with digital. But we see something like this and we see a 4K transfer that just pops off the screen, and you're just sort of like, well, I don't really know what I'm supposed to root for anymore. Like, you want butts and seats, and you want to see the best possible thing, and so you're just sort of like, well, gee, you know, do you want to lug giant reels, you know, pay to have them shipped and all this stuff? And there's just it's not practical, but at the same time, I love that we have that capability when it comes up.
We screened on 16 millimeter. We screened Santa Claus Conquers the Martians.
Oh my god!
which I love because I'm a Mystery Science Theater fan, and Mystery Science Theater does that. But we saw it, you know, clean. We saw the actual version, and then the next year was when we got our digital projector. And we screened a digital restoration, because that's the other thing. We live in this world where all these amazing, you know, doing the Lord's work, all these amazing indie restoration facilities like AGFA and Vinegar Syndrome and Shout Factory are finding these lost gems that are not the Maltese Falcon, are not Citizen Kane.
They're my Maltese Falcon.
Yeah, but without them would be gone. And so 2 years apart, 1 year apart, watched Santa Claus Conquers the Martians on real beat up film versus digital restoration, and the digital restoration was so amazing, like it didn't deserve it. Like, it was so beautiful, black and white cinematography, and so you see that and you're like, yep, that's digital's the way to go for these kind of things.
Now, listeners, I'm going to go off the cuff here. First, I'm going to start off with Eric because you mentioned that you guys showed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the X-rated version. Now, for some new listeners, they've heard about, I'm sure just the R-rated version of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But can you tell me, and me and the listeners, what made Toby Hooper's, what made that classic and got the X-rated rating for it? Because basically there's no gratuitous sex scenes, because everyone keeps being X-rated as, oh my God, they showed pornography, but
yeah. Well, that's the wild thing, because like whenever we hear an X rating, you always think, oh, pornography for sure. Yes. And the Mayfair was a pornography theater in the 70s for a brief time. So
that makes
as
sense,
a side note, and so what's funny about that is like we watched that cut and I expected it to be like way more footage and way more graphic or something like that, and it wasn't. And what's interesting is like the ratings in Canada, I think they basically just came down hard on it, because like by the time we got it, and presumably still 74, but it may have been 75 by that point, that it was still shocking, and it was so like over the top for that time period for a major release.
Yes.
And what a lot of people don't realize is that I'm sure this happened other places as well, but in Ottawa, I'm not certain if this was at the Mayfair that this happened, but in Ottawa, the police were actually called to theaters screening Texas Chainsaw, and it was taken away by police. Like they took the reels, because it was this X-rated, like over the, and we all know, we've seen the movie now, like it's really not much. I like, incredible movie, one of the greatest horror films of all time, but it's all in your head for the most part, and so like to be able to see that cut, and a lot of people who were at that screening probably also didn't know about that, the police aspect and all that, and it sort of gives a fun, I think it's actually in the Wikipedia article for Texas Chainsaw about an Ottawa theater and having the RCMP come and take away. I don't think they arrested the guy screening the movie, but still, to my mind, like that's just crazy to think about, like, and just such a culture change, even to what would come a few years later with like an Evil Dead or so many other classics. And so like watching that, and that made it to me like even more special, even though it was a little choppy and it was a little discolored and all that. It wasn't for me obviously the first time seeing that movie, but to see it and knowing that like this was considered in Canada at least to be an X-rated film was just like so powerful, and kind of transcends the actual like shape that the print itself was in, so like to be a part of that, I thought was so cool, even though pretty much everyone left when Texas Chainsaw 2 came on, but I stayed, so like it was still a very memorable evening.
That's great. And then for listeners again, and Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, because now again, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, if I remember correctly, it was kind of like even banned in certain states, well, in the United States. And I think even if you try to rent it from a video store, it was like you couldn't find it, or it was one of those where if you were at some type of con, you would probably, like convention, a comic book convention, you probably could get a bootleg.
Yeah, like a third generation VHS. But I mean, it was definitely a video nasty in the UK as well, and like certainly like snapped up. I'm sure tons of copies were burned at that time as well, and it's just like, so it's almost comical to think about it at this point, just with how much access that we have to everything in the world. But yeah, like that was such a crazy time.
Because the thing is, again, I've seen the movie, finally saw the movie like last year on Flicks. It's amazing how, growing up in the 70s and 80s, it would never be shown on cable because it's just too brutal. But then again, that movie, you don't really see any gore or blood. I mean, it's always it's in your head. Leatherface smashing the guy's head, but you don't see it. All you hear is
What I find so crazy is how it's really quite a beautiful movie as well. Like some of the shots are really breathtaking, especially in like 4K transfers and stuff like that. Like what the shot I always think of is when the van is sort of slowing down to pick up the hitchhiker, and you have that wide angle shot of just the sky and the van, and it's just beautifully framed, and it looks so good. And it's just, I think that's something that was lost along the way for a lot of people when they were just like, oh, this stupid gore fest or whatever, which it isn't either of those things, but it really is like a very well crafted movie.
All right, now Josh, I'm kind of going off the cuff because you also mentioned one of my guilty pleasure films as a kid, Santa Claus Conquered the Martians. Can you
Yeah.
tell our listeners what is so special about this movie? Because I kind of know it's like either the top 3 movies, not the best list. It's
Yeah,
one of those big cult classics.
it's a bonkers holiday season movie where Santa Claus gets kidnapped by Martians, so he will bring Christmas to Mars. And it's just like it's made for about a nickel. It looks like sets from a high school play, and it's just hilarious. And it has been riffed by both Mystery Science Theater and Riff Tracks, so you can see 2 different groups of people make fun of it.
Yes,
but watching something like that with a crowd, it really shows you why watching movies in a cinema is better than at home. Yes, there's the convenience of being at home and you could watch whatever you want and you can pause and all that kind of stuff. But even, like, say we had 50 people watching Santa Claus Conquers the Martians that night, just people laughing and kind of being just stunned at how weird the movie is. And then a movie like that getting a round of applause at the end, it's just super fun. And it's this lost thing, like watching a movie like that. I forget what year it's from, but watching it at home, you're watching a movie at home. But watching that at a cinema, especially like the Mayfair, it really feels like time travel. It really kind of shuts off your other senses and just lets you focus on watching this movie that, when we screened it a few years back, it probably hadn't been on a big screen since it first came out. It was probably at a drive-in in Ottawa back in 1960 or whatever year that movie is. And that's fun. That is really that nobody else is hosting that kind of event. So it's easy to find that movie now. I think it might even, it's public domain, so I don't think it's hard to find. But anytime we have a chance to screen some weird cult movie like that, we do pretty much.
And I'm going to say that's a great segue into my next question. And like I said, again, actually, Eric, I'll start off with you. So kind of like, what kind of movies does the Mayfair show, and then what I'm talking about is like, is it kind of like, is it like, world premiere movies? And Josh, you already mentioned like cult classics, but what range of movies do you guys show, basically?
Well, it's like, that's one of the things that I love about it so much, because like there's such a good mix, and like there is like, Ottawa is lucky enough to have 2 independent theaters, and I find like and sometimes there's a bit of a bleed over between the 2 in terms of what they show. But I find that the other one kind of tended to be more art housey type stuff and whatnot, and we do show that as well. Yes. But the thing I like about us is like it's a really good mix of new and old, and generally avoiding blockbusters. But occasionally we'll show like a Star Wars or King Kong, Godzilla type of thing. Yeah. But generally, like, we're really well positioned to accept premieres of sort of mid-level films that are, like not, budgets of 10 to 15 million, 40 million, something like that. And the Cineplex, or the multiplex, I should say, they don't really seem to have the space for stuff like that, especially nowadays when they're playing, Marvel in every screen, and it's great. I mean, that's great for people going to see Marvel movies, which is also us, obviously, but, it just, you can only play so much. So, like we typically tend to have sort of new transfers of classic movies, more and more these days too, with more of them coming out. But also, like dramas, documentaries, and anything from like sort of like horror to action to comedy, to sort of festival stuff. So it's like I'm always amazed at I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to be the booker for us, because it's just so hard to juggle, the timing and what's going to appeal to everyone. But generally we have like a 3:00 movie, 6:00 movie, 9:00 movie, and it's such a beautiful mix of like, obviously like a bit of an older crowd in the early afternoon when most people are at work, and at 6:00 is kind of a compromise between the two, and might be like a lighthearted or kind of an actiony thing, and then 9:00 can be like a modern horror movie or something like that, So a lot of theaters wouldn't be able to take that risk and juggle so many genres, but we really do an admirable job.
I'm going to ask Josh, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, it's what I love about the Mayfair is that we kind of show something for everybody. Just so today we screened a movie called The Phantom of the Open as our matinee, which is a really great British comedy, a true story about the world's worst golfer, starring Mark Rylance, who's been the hardest working man in show business the past few years. So that's kind of that's the kind of movie that you don't want to be too cliche or too, judging people ageist or anything, but that's like a nice senior citizen movie. That's the kind of movie you could bring mom to. Then our 6:00 movie today was Everything Everywhere All at Once. So giant, epic sci-fi martial arts, amazing movie.
And it's our 6th week?
Yes, and it's going away. That's it.
That's a huge run.
It had a good run. And then our 9:00 movie is Thief, the Michael Mann early 80s R-rated crime genre movie. And we're playing that as a tribute to James Caan. So that's another thing, is like we're not superb business people because we play stuff that we know will get a crowd, but we also will play Thief for a couple nights as a tribute to James Caan. And that might not get the biggest crowd, but it's a nice thing to do, and it's kind of what we've done. When Leonard Nimoy passed away, we screened Star Trek II, and when David Bowie passed away and Prince passed away. When Prince passed away, we played Purple Rain, which was an amazing night. It felt like being at a concert. So, but yeah, that's what I like about the Mayfair, is that it's really something for everybody. Because if you don't like horror films, there's probably a British drama playing earlier in the day. And if you don't like British dramas, there's a documentary about something cool playing at another time. So week to week, it's always diverse.
You know what I love about your guys' theater, again, is that you guys have the flexibility, like you said, like you're going to play the 1980 movie Thief. I'm going to say I remember when that movie came out on HBO back in the 80s. Now, but it's kind of nice because you guys can do, the nice tribute to James Caan. Like, it's probably, and I could be wrong, it's probably one of his least known works in, that people remember, because everyone will always remember Rollerball or recently Elf, but not too many of them probably would know these hidden gems, of Thief, and directed by Michael Mann too. Yeah,
and early Michael Mann too, and like the Tangerine Dream soundtrack is so good and like almost makes the movie. I mean, James Caan makes the movie, but the soundtrack is such a huge part.
And like that might not have been on screen in Ottawa since the 80s.
Yeah,
it might have been a while. And again, that's a digital restoration that we're screening, because nowadays it's libraries are really opening up, because film, it's physical, it falls apart every time you play it. It gets a little worse. But now we really have a nice symbiosis with the streaming services, because if they're making a 2K or 4K movie for a streaming service, that means they've got it ready to go to give to us to screen as well. Nice. So more and more, it's really funny. It doesn't make sense, but we're screening movies from Amazon or from Netflix, or recently a couple from Shudder. Is Shudder Canadian or everywhere? I forget.
I think it's everywhere now. I think it started out in the States, but I might be totally off base. But
right, so like we show that stuff because we can show it for a couple days.
Yes,
and then it goes to a streaming service, so people in town get to see it on the big screen.
Yes,
but I think that's good, because we just played the Canadian premiere of a movie called Mad God, which is this bonkers, very R-rated stop motion animation, kind of a Descent into Hell kind of movie. It's by Phil Tippett, whose claim to fame was he worked on the Star Wars movies and Jurassic Park and all kinds of stuff. RoboCop. So we got to screen that movie. It did very well, but I always think there's no shame in that going to Shudder the same time we have it on the big screen, because what about that person living in a small little town that doesn't have a movie theater? Now they can subscribe to Shudder or pay $5 to get it video on demand and support this little independent movie and not steal it online.
Yes.
And that's good for everybody. So they get to support the genre they like. The filmmaker appreciates that because it's a little no-budget movie. And our patrons get to see it on the big screen. And so people are really scared of this, like, oh, streaming services and stuff. I'm like, no, it's fine. Like, people seem to forget that I want to find proof of this so I can quote it, but I bet you when TVs came out, there was probably an article in the newspaper saying the death of cinema. Nobody's going to go to movies anymore. Everyone's going to watch TV. And then when VCRs came out, and when HBO happened, and when video stores happened, every time something happens, they say it's going to kill cinema, and it never kills cinema. And as we speak, all these big movies are still making, like, you know, Doctor Strange, Spider-Man, Jurassic World are all making $800, $1 billion, and Everything Everywhere is, I think, going to make $100 million, and that's a little movie that stars Michelle Yeoh, and so people are still going to movies. So it's a neat time we're in for that kind of distribution.
Actually, Josh, I'm gonna I remember reading an article in the early 90s when there was talk of running top budget movies like a day-to-date release.
Right.
And I remember reading that article, and the argument was, no, this is going to kill the movie theaters. We shouldn't do this, blah, blah, blah. And I remember it came out, the article came out at the time of when Terminator 2 came out. And I'm going, oh my God, 30 years later, look what's happening now. You know, especially during the pandemic, you know, Black Widow was released day of date, you know, but people still want to go see it in the theaters. Yeah,
I think it could change things. Like, say, you know, when we were kids and E.T. was in theaters for a year, that might not happen anymore. But you can still have Doctor Strange come out for whatever the math is, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, make $800 million, and then go to a streaming service. And it's clearly working because, you know, the Batman came out, made a bunch of money, came out on, you know, quote unquote TV really fast. But they've greenlit a sequel, so it's made its money back. And I think sometimes it might work the other way, where a movie makes a little bit of money on the big screen, but then does really well on the small screen, and that instigates a sequel happening. So it's really not the death of things. And I'm always like, you all remember VHS, right? Like, you remember how popular video stores were, and movie theaters hung in there. So,
Eric, I'm going to ask, do you want to add anything to what Josh has said?
Oh man, it's he pretty much nailed it there. Like, it's I always feel like I've been privileged to be sort of invited onto Josh's baby, which is the podcast, and like to have him. It's cool, like, to see the amount of hats that he's been able to wear as like not only a fan but an owner and running the social media and whatever. So like, you know, it's fun to like. I almost feel like I'm a listener some of the time listening to him talk about the theater, because I'm just like, hey, you know, we've really done a good job shepherding this into this like fun new thing. But I'm also like, you know, he's really nailed all the facts on that particular one.
All right, guys. I'm going to continue on. Actually, I'm going to start off with you, Eric.
Sure.
What kind of hidden treasures did you guys find working at the Mayfair? Because I know you guys found a box of 35 millimeter trailers. What about posters or anything else?
Man, well, like, what's interesting is like there is a well, I was gonna say pretty large. It's not that large, but I was like, there's actually 2 separate basement. Well, I guess 3 if you count there's a kind of a weird upstairs crawl space basement, crawl spacement, if you will, and but, you know, so they're all very cool. But there's actually a poster room as one of the things, and so like, or as one of the basements, that is. And so like, I've kind of rooted around through there before, and like, I think a lot of the stuff is not maybe stuff that I've discovered myself, but like, there's so many cool vintage posters. I mean, not as many as people would think. Like, if there's not, you know, a vintage Empire Strikes Back down there or something like that. Like, those are all at Lee's house, I think, because he's the Star Wars guy and he's the booker. So I'm just like, if there's anything like that, he's gonna have it. But the creepiest thing that I found was a bunch of mannequins in the one basement underneath the snack bar, which was just like, I didn't know about these mannequins. I don't know if anyone else did. I'm sure they did. But I was like going down, we have like a creepy, almost like an Evil Dead-esque basement down there. So when you go to change the pop or get more cups or whatever, you know, you got to go down there. And so the first time, and it's also like, there is a light switch, but it takes like a few seconds to flicker on, straight horror movie style. Like, this couldn't be more creepy. And so you go down there trying to get your thing or whatever it is, and you just in the corner, there's just like this creepy head in the corner and like a loose arm and like missing an arm. And I was like, what the hell are these and what are they doing here?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like one of those things. And you mentioned, you're like, oh yeah, no, those are the mannequins. Like I never really got closure on it. I don't know why they're down there or what they were for. But we've now integrated them into the theater, and so by the snack bar, they're wearing like a shirt for the room or something that we had for sale, and they'll have like the mask on during COVID. So it's kind of cool. They've become coworkers. Mm-hmm. So with me not selling popcorn anymore, now we've got mannequins to replace me. So I don't know how to feel about that.
Now, Josh, I'm going to mention because on the Mayfair website, you guys are selling the 35 millimeter trailers. Is that correct?
Yeah, during COVID times, which, you know, we're still in COVID times, but when we were in lockdown, we were just kind of doing whatever we could to make some money. And so and it's all kind of stuff we still do. So we sold off a lot of posters and 35 millimeter trailers. And the mindset there is, you know, I'm a collector, I'm a nerd, but we don't need all these things. So we still kept a lot of posters because there's some stuff like Gremlins or Ghostbusters or, you know, that we will play again. Yeah. So we didn't get rid of any of that, but a lot of more newer stuff, a lot of stuff we had doubles of. And the trailers, we just had a ton. We had, and I think 20 years ago, probably somebody just threw out a ton of them. But so we kept a bunch that are super neat because we might make use of them. But a lot of them were more recent stuff, but we sold hundreds of trailers at $20 a pop, and that really helped us a lot. And it ranged from movies that people might have an association with to just people thought it was cool to have a 35 millimeter trailer sitting on their shelf. One kid bought dozens and dozens and dozens, and I was just like, this is cool, but there's a point where you're like, you know, if you come to my house, I took the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles trailer. Yeah, so I get to point at that and be like, I have one trailer, there it is. But I think this kid thought it was awesome and just collected them. And he would, I think he's a filmmaker himself, so he would like take out bits and put it on his Instagram, like showing it over a light box and stuff like that. But yeah, so it was just a great fun thing to do. It was good publicity, and I'm a collector nerd, but I'm also like, instead of those all hiding away in our basement, it's cool that now, and I'm just throwing out this number, that there's 300 people in Ottawa and a handful of people elsewhere in the world who have a trailer up on their shelf and can point at it and go, that's from the Mayfair. And that's way cooler than them all just hiding in storage.
Well, and you actually found one for Alien 3 for my friend as well. She's a huge Aliens fan, and so he found an original trailer for Alien 3. And so my friend found out about that and just lost her mind and was like, oh, I have to have it. And in the process, she went and picked it up. I don't remember the exact timeline of this, but Josh also found an original poster from Alien 3 and was like, hey, I think your friend would like this. I'm like, yes, she would. And she lost her mind again. And so, like, that was just, for her, that was like Christmas, you know, Santa Claus conquers the Alien 3, or whatever you want to say.
All right. So, Josh, I'm going to ask you this question. It's an off-the-cuff question, because the Mayfair is 90 years old. Any cool ghost stories you heard?
So, right before my time, some Ghostbusters came into the cinema, and real-life Ghostbusters aren't as cool as movie Ghostbusters.
Yeah.
But they had their equipment, and they looked around, and they concluded that we are indeed haunted. And a number of people have seen, like nothing too big. My big run-in, my story was one night I was closing, and a big empty 1930s cinema when you're in there all alone. I've said before, like, even if you don't believe in anything supernatural, you just kind of have this lizard brain, you know, you have this fear factor. And so your subconscious is going, danger, this is creepy. And there's a door to the basement, so I clicked off the lights, the power, and I closed that door. And any skeptic could argue that this was anything else. But it felt 100% like somebody pulled the door in the other direction.
Oh, yes.
And instinctively, I grabbed the door, and I felt it, like, pull out of my hand.
Yeah, oh, God.
and then I just got out of there.
Yeah.
And then the funny thing is, I tweeted that, and I got dozens of people replying, just basically going like, "Oh no, 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 no!" And I put a photo of just what the cinema looks like, so you could just see kind of exit signs and a few little lights. But when you're in there alone, and I believe this is an illusion of just echoing sound, but every once in a while you'll be sitting in there alone in the office before anybody else comes in, and I think it's just sound bouncing off through our box office and lobby. But a couple of times I've heard footsteps coming at me, and then nobody's there. So once again, any skeptic could be like, you're imagining it, it was a sound. But when you have been told it is a haunted building and you hear that, you still get freaked out.
What about you, Eric?
Oh man, like I've mostly just heard stories, like, but for me it's like the vibe of that place. I tell Josh this all the time, but it's just like you can really feel the spirits in that place, like not physically or like see anything, but just like being in that room that has been there for now 90 years, and just like the architecture being the same, and like we've got an old, well, I don't want to say creepy piano, but I mean just because it's in there it feels more creepy than it actually is. And like, there's definitely a feel that you get, and just to know like all the different incarnations that the theater has been, and the different hats that it's worn over the years, so like I've heard stories, and people, I'm pretty sure, because we actually have a couple of couches in addition to seats, and like a few easy chairs. So that's kind of fun. And like I've got a particular couch I like to get to, before everyone else, kind of thing. But there's one in the back corner that I've heard is apparently, I don't know if the couch itself is haunted or if it's just that the ghost likes sitting up there. But I've heard stories from a few people where they sort of think they hear something maybe out of the corner of your eye, kind of thing. And it's the kind of place where you're like, I am certain at least one person has died there. Like there's no way they haven't over 90 years. Like it's just impossible, So I definitely, I feel like it almost has like a spiritual feel for like lovers of film,
Yes.
And so I'm good not actually seeing anything. As much as a horror movie fan as I am, I'm like, I'm kind of good not having that in my life. But when you're in there and it's kind of dark, your mind wanders for sure.
All right, I'm slowly going to start wrapping things up, guys. Josh, I'm going to ask you this question. Was there any 90th anniversary celebration that you guys did for the theater, or is there anything planned yet? Or
it's funny, Eric was just asking about that, and it's the most humble brag, but the problem at the Mayfair is we're always playing awesome things. So to then play other awesome things, it doesn't stand out as much. Like, just for example, like pretend we only screened new movies. Well, in the recent weeks and months, we had a classic Western festival, or screening stuff like Creepshow and Halloween 3 and retro horror and that kind of thing. So although we haven't done anything with a 90th anniversary stamp on it, I think we will before the end of the year, especially even if as minimal as on the actual day itself, try to do something extra special. The first movie that ever screened at the Mayfair, and we know this because part of our pre-show slideshow, we actually managed to find the ad, just thanks to the internet, and it's an old movie called The Blue Danube, which I've never seen, but I think is a pretty famous kind of Criterion kind of movie. So I don't know if it's available. Like, it's not like a really famous movie, but that would be super fun to screen if at all possible. But we always have cool stuff. Like we will have a couple of more silent film live bands happening before the end of the year. Also, we're on the heels of all this COVID stuff, right? So it's a little bit difficult. People keep asking us about two things specifically: is Rocky Horror Picture Show and Saturday morning cartoons.
Yes.
So the problem with both those things is we wish for the best, but numbers aren't gone. Like, we're not like magically cured yet. So our shadow cast for the Rocky Horror, when they do the show, it's very interactive. It's kissing cheeks and sitting on laps and all that kind of stuff. So that's hard to ask a performer to do during these times. And then Saturday morning cartoons, we have a cereal buffet, and little kids are germ magnets at the best of time. So I can't help but think about that, of if there's 100 kids and they're all wiping their nose and grabbing cereal boxes and milk and stuff like that. So there's a few special events like that and this is just me talking, not even the business, that I'm just a little bit hesitant still.
Yeah, same with The Room as well. Like we were screening The Room every month, and it always did well. But a big aspect of that is like throwing spoons and touching spoons and throwing them, and then who's picking these spoons up, So we get a lot of that too, where people are like, "When's The Room coming back?" And you're like, "Well, business wise, yes, that would be good. COVID wise, maybe we hold off a little bit." But the actual 90th anniversary is December 5th, so we still got time to figure. And no matter what, I'm gonna be advertising that day as the 90th anniversary, no matter what's playing.
Now, Josh, I'm gonna, like you said, like Saturday morning cartoons, and you guys had the cereal buffet, and kids are like a germ magnet. I think this reference. Damn cursed children.
Yeah. I know that book.
Yes. All right. Eric, I'm gonna ask you this question. Because I'm pretty much sure. So the theater has held like world premiere first run movies, right, of like independent films and stuff like that. Was there any memorable ones, or did you guys have any actors or the directors appear at the Mayfair?
For sure. Like one that I found, well, for me personally anyways, was really cool was during the pandemic, they actually did what was essentially a world premiere of a Nicolas Cage movie called Jiu-Jitsu. And it was a private screening. One of the guys who was in the movie is basically for friends and family kind of thing. But I pretty much begged Josh to let me sit in on the movie because I was like, I need to be part of this. Like I need to be. So I just sat in the back and didn't say anything and just kind of let them do their thing. But for me, like that was so cool because they had a red carpet and they had posters and all that. Nice. And it was a little weird in a way because it wasn't open to the public. So it's just, if you were walking by, you'd be like, what's going on again?
Yeah.
But for me being a big Cage fan, like just to be part of that and especially to have, and I even was able to get a poster because there was a couple extras and it just, I wouldn't have had the guts to go up to the guy and have him sign my poster at his own screening, but I thought that was very cool. But like they've done several screens, but like in terms of actors and stuff happening, like we've had like Greg Sestero has presented The Room a couple times, and Tommy Wiseau has come with him as well.
Nice.
And yeah, that's done really well. And he's got a new horror movie coming out. Greg Sestero does, that hopefully is going to be bringing that to the Mayfair this year. Like we don't have a date on that, but one of the cool ones was Crispin Glover actually came and showed a few of his movies that he had made. And he did like a meet and greet and a signing, and I'm pretty sure that Josh and his now wife bonded over that experience, which makes it even more special.
Yeah, Crispin Glover, who's the nicest guy in the world. He's an eccentric, weird guy, but the nicest guy in the world, and he wouldn't leave before everyone had an autograph, and was really nice and great to the fans. But so I got him to autograph my Willard DVD. And he had met, at the time, the person I was dating, Gwen, who is now my wife. But this actor, Crispin Glover, amongst meeting so many people, and he was touring at the time with his movies, he said to me something like, "Oh, where's Gwen tonight?" Because she couldn't make the other screening because she was working that night. And he remembered. He was like, "Where's Gwen tonight?" So I said, "Oh, she had to work, but she wishes she could be here." And so he signed my DVD to Gwen and Josh, and then wrote like a paragraph on it. So then I got to bring that to Gwen and be like, well, Crispin Glover just took our relationship to the next level because now we've got both our names on this DVD. And so I can't wait for him to come back, which he also has another movie almost done. So we hope he comes back sooner or later. So, 8 or 10 years later, I get to meet him again and be like, hey, remember this? Now we're married.
Amazing. Well, and we also, what I think is cool is before they were famous, but we had Tom Cruise and Ryan Gosling both came to the theater to enjoy some movies like during their, childhood, early teens, late teens, whatever. But and I'm pretty sure Tom Cruise referenced it on a late night show or like Letterman or whatever it was, but he called us the Mayflower Theater. So it was like so close. We almost got a cool shout out.
Yeah, he was, I forget the story, but Tom Cruise was an army brat, I guess. And so he wasn't in Ottawa for long, but for like a year he was in Ottawa. So yeah, so at I forget if it was an Oscar speech or just on a talk show, but yeah, he mentioned us but got our name wrong, which is understandable if he didn't live here for 20 years, but yeah, so he was in the cinema at least.
That is so cool. Okay, let's see. I'm gonna start wrapping things up. Actually, yeah. Now, Josh, I'm gonna start with you. Now, I know during the pandemic shutdown, like you mentioned that you guys sold the 35 millimeter, trailers to keep things going. I know you guys rented out the theater marquee. Do you remember any funny requests that stuck out?
So I was in the lucky position of twofold. One, I had a bunch of comic books come out during the pandemic, which is like my dream come true. And two, I was on the receiving end of a lot of Mayfair love because my partner Lee and I as well. Lee did a bunch of interviews as well, but I did a bunch of interviews for TV, for radio, for podcasts about the Mayfair, and I was on the receiving end of taking the orders for the posters, the prints, the marquee. So the marquee specifically was just this tidal wave of Mayfair love because it ranged from baby announcements to wedding proposals to 50th anniversaries, and some friends who have a podcast in LA, they had a marquee, and an old classmate I hadn't seen forever who lives in Vancouver now, which is like the other side of the country.
Yes.
Bought and both marquees and buying names on seats. So these are kind of a mix of those people. But up in way northern Canada, in Nunavut, somebody bought a seat. So just all kinds of stuff like that. And everybody who bought a seat or a marquee had a story. So they were like, my grandma used to work here, or sadly but lovely, people buying name tags on the poster boxes or the seats that are like, there's at least a couple of, this is somebody who was a giant Mayfair fan who has passed away. And so they have this kind of little eulogy tag at the Mayfair. So I got to be on the receiving end of all these people who would be like, oh, is the marquee available this day? Or, oh, is chair number 73 still available? And every one of them had a story. Every one of them were like, oh, just goofy stuff. Like, oh, this, I'm putting my dog's name on this.
Yeah.
Or this was the first date for my wife and I, so we're putting both our names on this. Or it's a local business who just in the time of just everybody scrambling for money, that some local businesses rented the marquee and put their business, so they were supporting us. And there's a great feeling about that for kind of indie businesses around town. So yeah, it was very nice to be able to get choked up a number of times by people saying nice stories about us.
Oh, that's really nice. Now, Eric, I'm going to ask you this question. Are there any upcoming events for September or October? Because the thing is, when this interview is released, it'll probably be towards sometime either in August or early part of September.
Yeah, like, well, it's funny because like we at the Mayfair, we take Halloween month very seriously, obviously, and so we kind of joke actually, like it generally Halloween kind of extends from September to November for us, because October is obviously October, but there tends to be stuff literally every year this happens where it's something like we can get that we would love to have in October, but we can only get it last week of September, first week of November. So we've definitely had some stuff where you're just sort of like, I mean, to the average person who isn't us, you might be a little confused to see it like, well, hey, like this, it's not October. Why are you still playing this? No. But what's interesting is like, there isn't like a specific plan to my knowledge yet. I know they're working on a couple of things behind the scenes, but I find, it's the 40th anniversary of so many classics now.
Yes.
That, I mean, like including like a Creep Show or like an E.T. or The Thing or whatever, you go on forever. So I think like there's been a concentrated effort to try to acquire some of that stuff this year and really make it special. And especially with like everything that everyone's been going through for the last 2 years, to have some sense of normalcy, especially for something that's escapist, like a horror or a thriller type of thing. Like it's something I look forward to every year. And I almost in some ways hold off on asking what we're going to get, because every week I'm always, even when we do the podcast, like I usually don't look to see what's playing, because then when Josh reads it off, I'm like, oh my God, that's amazing. So it's like, I like to think it's kind of like the people, the listeners feel the same way, where they're like, I didn't expect him to say that. So I almost like don't want to know, but every year they kill it every October, September, November. So I know it's going to be good this year too.
That's nice. And that's a nice segue into my next question. And Josh, I'm going to ask you this. So how did the Mayfair Theater podcast come about?
Years back, we were just, we would chat. I would chat with the projectionist or chat with the manager, and either myself or somebody else would joke and be like, we just talked for half an hour. That could have been a podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what eventually happened. And we realized it's good publicity. We get a lot of listeners. We get a lot of local listeners.
Mm-hmm.
We've actually sold ad space a few times, so we're actually bringing in money for the cinema.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah.
And nowadays it's easy, right? Like say if we were doing the same thing pre-internet, it would be a radio show. We would have to go to Ottawa University and book the space and have a technician, and it would be live or something,
Mm-hmm.
Whereas this, I'm not a super techie at all, but with a laptop and a couple microphones and a downloaded program, and then me sitting at home for a few hours every week and doing a bit of editing on it, you get a podcast. So it's a lot of fun, and every time somebody comes in, and I know Eric has this as well, probably especially back when he was behind the candy bar more often, every once in a while someone come in and recognize your voice and go, you're on the podcast. And you get this like, nice. Oh, I didn't think anybody actually listened, but people actually listen to it.
Yeah, and like literally today to this day is the 5th anniversary of me joining the podcast. I didn't realize Facebook had to tell me that, but so it was actually like, it feels like it, but also doesn't feel like it. And it's so weird because I mean, Josh was already doing it for 2.5 years before I started.
Mm-hmm.
And like my first episode was the 125th episode. So it's pretty wild to listen to like episode 1,
Mm-hmm.
episode 125 and episode whatever the hell it is now. I don't know, 350 or whatever, because like, it's just one of those things. You're just chatting with your friend about stuff you love. And we never have a script. We never, not to look too far behind the curtain, I guess, but we just kind of go and we talk,
Mm-hmm.
and it works every time, or at least to my ears it does, and people seem to enjoy it. So man, I love it.
And we put way less effort into it than other podcasts because we do have special guests sometimes, but it's when somebody's in the building. Mm-hmm. It's when a filmmaker is coming to do an introduction or that sort of thing. But for the most part, it's Eric and myself and one of the other Mayfair folks, a couple of the other Mayfair folks.
Mm-hmm.
So that's good because there's never enough hours in the day. So if I was trying to wrangle down other guests and stuff as well, people are surprised we've managed to keep it weekly. But that's the reason. It's because, Eric's been on almost every one for the past 5 years, but a couple he's been out of town. Mm-hmm. So I'll just wrangle our friend Sam from the Rocky Horror Shadowcast, or Lee will come in or something like that. We've had some stand-up comedy in the cinema, so a couple of those guys have come in and been on a few episodes.
Nice.
So we have guests once in a while.
Occasionally.
Yeah. But we just kind of keep it simple, and it's just a nice little half hour. Like every podcast ever, we get distracted, and sometimes we'll talk about completely other things for 25 minutes and then be like, oh, we got to talk about the movies for 10 minutes.
Yes. And listeners, like Josh and Eric has said, I mean, there is kind of a little format of, what the Mayfair is showing. But other than that, it's, I've listened to some episodes. It's great. I love it. I think the thing I really love about it, it's the language is clean, and it's like only 30 to 40 minutes. And you guys talk about not only your love for movies, but also pop culture stuff that are attached to the movies as well, too. And that's what I love about, listening to to your podcast. Now, this is a perfect segue into my next question, and it's a fun question. And I'm going to point it to Eric, and Josh, you can chime in, because I know in one episode you guys talked about, did you guys ever get Treat Williams? Now, he is the actor of Prince of the City movie that was released back in the 80s. And I also found he's also an actor. He was on regular series on the TV show Everwood. And I found this on his Wikipedia page. He was uncredited in Empire Strikes Back as Echo Base Troop. I couldn't believe it.
Man. Yeah, that's so crazy.
Did you guys ever have him follow you guys on social media, or did you ever try to invite him up to the Mayfair to do a Treat Williams movie festival or something.
You know, man, I wish that we had. I'm going to after today. I'll tell you that because I definitely we've talked about him on multiple podcasts, which is not something I would have thought about until this question. But thinking about it, I was like, first of all, our coworker Andrew, who's sometimes on the podcast, he's a huge fan of Deep Rising, which is like a mostly forgotten creature feature, you know, from the late '90s, early 2000s. And I mean, like that was maybe one of the first times I kind of noticed him as well, which is not what Treat Williams probably wants to hear. But anyway, I'm sure he had a good time filming it. But it's funny because like the reason we brought him up in the first place is we were talking about the Substitute series, and he's not in the original, but he was in the Substitute 2, 3, and 4.
Yes.
And I just like I find that so wild. Like I have a real fascination. I mean, we all do on the podcast, anyways. Have a fascination with these direct-to-video sequels to a sort of random movie you might not even have thought was a big enough hit to merit one sequel, let alone several. Yeah. And so, like, yeah, I find that hilarious, and like we were genuine fans of his work. But hilariously, I was just watching one of his movies yesterday, 1988, you know, classic, not classic, called Night of the Sharks. So I'm a huge. Yeah, no, I'm not recommending it in a, you know, real movie type of way, but it's really funny to me to see guys like this that are, you know, become very popular and are known for several different things and are in Empire Strikes Back that you don't even know about. Yeah. But then to watch like a cheapo shark movie that nobody remembers, and then you're like, oh my God, Treat Williams. So like we really do have a kinship with him on the podcast. I definitely got to get him to follow us now.
He's just one of those working actors who, in an alternate universe, would be Harrison Ford. Because in his early career, it was like Hair and 1941 and stuff like that. And he's never not worked, but you just see how hard it is to make movies and be famous. Like how many people are truly famous. And in his early career, that's what I read. Like, a lot of people were like, this guy, he's going to be the next big star.
Yes.
And Deep Rising was a shot at that in the mid-90s, but it flopped. And he's in this really good gangster movie called Things to Do in Denver When You're Dead.
Oh,
but I think that came out right around Pulp Fiction, and like Pulp Fiction did really well, and it didn't. So in an alternate universe where Things to Do in Denver Where You're Dead did well, he could have been like the Travolta comeback right then.
Yes.
So that's why I really like him, is he's a really good actor. By all accounts, the nicest guy in Hollywood. Where I think we have a shot at him is that Gwen and I saw him in one of those bazillion Hallmark Christmas movies recently. Ottawa films about 20 Hallmark movies a year. For whatever reason, Ottawa has become a hub for Hallmark movies. So that's where I think we got a shot. He could show up here doing a Hallmark movie. That's when we get him. We say, hey, we're big fans. Come to the Mayfair. We're going to screen Deep Rising or something.
Or The Phantom or something. I think that was the other one. The Phantom was the same year as Deep Rising. And I think a lot of people thought that might take off. And, you know, Billy Zane would have this new franchise. And that is not how it went.
Yeah. And so it's funny. Like, so I think we just talked about him half a dozen times in a row. And it was all innocently. Like, somebody brought up Deep Rising, or somebody brought up 1941, or somebody brought up The Substitute. And then we realized we kept talking about Treat Williams. And I think Andrew had just seen him on The Simpsons maybe or something.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, so he's one of those actors who, bad news, he didn't become Harrison Ford. Good news, look at his IMDb. He never stops working.
Yeah. I think that's the main thing right now. It's just he never stopped working. Yeah. All right. Josh, I'm going to slowly start wrapping things up. I'm going to start with this question, 2 more questions. I'll ask you first, Josh. What is the most fun or exciting thing that you love working at the Mayfair?
Well, the biggest perk, and we have become so desensitized to it that I could never stop working at the Mayfair because it's the best thing in the world, is that after Eric and I do a podcast on an early Tuesday afternoon, morning, we have time to watch a movie before people show up to watch a movie.
Oh, nice.
So we can watch anything we want. And especially nowadays, the streaming services are all HD. Or, you know, Blu-rays are so readily available. Or we'll just watch something that we might not be like, hey, we're here. Let's watch a movie. We don't got to come back at 9 o'clock. So that, and being able to do that for friends' birthday parties and for friends' kids and that sort of thing. So that's the biggest perk, is being able to come in. You could do it as a midnight movie. That's past my bedtime more and more, so I like to do it at noon till 2, and then versus that. So that's the coolest thing about running the theater, is being able to sneak in and watch movies when you want to.
That's nice.
We watched a movie recently, like a weird, obscure, nobody's watched it since 1973 Edgar Allan Poe drive-in movie. And as the credits were rolling, I was like, we are the only people on planet Earth watching this movie in a cinema right now.
Yes.
Maybe somebody's watching it on Prime right now, but I guarantee you we're the only people on Earth, and that is a lovely privilege to have.
Yeah, I think that a lot too about stuff that doesn't get a theatrical release nowadays, because it is a huge privilege to be able to be like, oh, like, I don't know, like the new Predator movie is coming out straight to streaming, and that just won't get a theatrical release, despite the fact that it looks very good and has been getting good buzz. And to know that I can be like, hey, Mr. Josh, can we watch it? Or like the Munsters or something like that, like where it's like something where, like there just isn't an opportunity to ever see this in a theater ever. And I'm just like, the privilege that we have to be able to do that is incredible. And I was actually going to say, for my answer,
yes,
I was going to say it's easy to say that the private screenings that we've done, is a huge, like, I mean, that's the easy answer. But honestly, for me, it's seeing the look on people's faces as they come to the theater for the first time, and seeing the sense of joy and the wonder in someone discovering my personal fortress of solitude and Josh's. It means so much, and it always reminds me of how important places like this are, especially in this day and age, and to just be able to be part of that, or to hear people clapping after a classic movie, or talking about how much they enjoyed a secret screening or something. It makes you want to cry in the best way.
We had just yesterday a private rental in, and it was 2 school buses full of kids to watch a movie. It was summer camp, and so they were just coming to watch a cartoon up on the big screen. And what you forget, this blew my mind. These were like little kids, right? These were like 5-year-olds.
Oh, yes.
And with the pandemic and how old these kids are, almost every one of these kids, this was their first time in a theater.
Yes.
And they were lovely little kids, and they all had their little masks on, and it was super fun. And they came in, and a number of them, comically, were like gasping with wonder and you would hear them say, "Are we going to watch a movie in here?" And when you get that, I think it's funny, because I'm like, oh, this is great. We've ruined movies for them now, because they're going to go to some ugly box multiplex and be like, this isn't what a movie is. So that kind of stuff is super fun. And whether it be it sounds so fake, but this has happened, where like the most adorable little kid will walk down the stairs, and we'll just be hanging out as people are leaving. And this little kid, and it was Princess Bride, and this kid was young to watch Princess Bride, but this little kid came down, and they've probably watched Princess Bride 200 times, because little kids just watch movies over and over and over at home. And she walked down and looked at me, and somehow knew I was like the boss, and said, "Thank you for showing my favorite movie." And it's just like,
your Grinch heart melted.
Yeah. And or conversely, with the older folks, last year we screened It's a Wonderful Life, which we do almost every year, at least every 2 years. And this like, they were 90 if they were anything. They were 100. And the guy was in a tie and a suit, and the wife was in a cool dress.
Yes.
And they were coming to see It's a Wonderful Life. And they probably, I don't know the story, but they probably have a story, whether that was their first date, whether they watch it every Christmas. But stuff like that is just amazing, that people have an association with us and do special events like that. So yeah, I said the selfish thing of free movies is cool, but Eric's right that it's just people's reaction, and it makes you feel good. There's always stress about leases and landlords and heritage status and all this stuff, and we're never lazy about it. But if push comes to shove and the worst case scenario ever happened, I don't think the worst case scenario will happen, because we have so many friends, and I think that will save us in the long run. If anything bad, the next time somebody wants to tear us down to build condos, the Prime Minister's wife has done events at the theater. So
Oh my
I,
God.
I think we're in good standing. I think we have help. So
Yes, I think you guys do. Excuse me. Eric, I'm going to start off with you. This is the last question. Any closing words to our listeners?
Oh, for sure. And I know this isn't an option for everybody wherever they are, but I always say support your local theater because honestly, you never know how long that you're going to have the chance. And I mean, it's easy to sort of get kind of down about it when you see places like this closing in small towns or big towns even like there aren't as many as there used to be. But honestly, if you can get out there and support a little place, even if it's not a theater, honestly, supporting places that are independent and bring you great vibes and great services is just so important nowadays. And it's there's a sadness to it, but there's also such joy when you're still able to be a part of that and bring that to people. So definitely do whatever you can to help independent artists because they need it more than ever.
Josh, what about you? Any last words or closing words? Sorry.
Yeah. If you are listening from far away, which from podcast land is always possible, but if you ever pass by Ottawa, drop by for a visit. It's a great city and a great little community we have. The Mayfair Theater right across the street is a place called Black Squirrel Books, which is a great bookstore. There's also House of Targ, which is a pinball arcade. And as we are tiptoeing back towards normalcy, Targ has started to have bands back in again. So Ottawa's a great town to visit. And yeah, if you have an independent cinema in your town, make sure to go to it because I have a lot of friends in the restaurant industry, and their biggest complaint is that someone will say, even in the before times, before COVID, they will say, "Oh, I loved that coffee shop. Oh, I love that restaurant. So sad that they closed." And you'll say, "Oh, when's the last time you went?" And they'll say, 8 years ago. And you're like, well, yeah, you got to keep going.
Yes.
So when you go to the cinema and you buy that ticket and you buy a bag of popcorn, you're really helping. Like, that money is helping keep that business afloat. And we hope to get back to this again, but in recent years, my wife and I visited places like Seattle or Philadelphia and even Toronto here in Ontario. And there's still great indie cinemas out there. And it's funny because I still will keep in touch with theaters in Vancouver and Philly and other places like that. And you see what they're programming and they see what we're programming. And there's a great community there. Anytime some indie cinema is doing a Kickstarter, I will buy a t-shirt from them or something like that. So it's and yeah, if you do want to buy a piece of treasure from the Mayfair, we still have those posters and trailers listed on our website, mayfairtheater.ca, and we have sent those out to faraway places. So check our list there and you can buy a little piece of indie cinema history as well.
Oh, okay.
Maybe an autographed copy of Damn Cursed Children while you're at it.
Oh yeah, you can do that too.
All right. Josh and Eric, mahalo. Thank you very much for your time. Just thank you for giving me the opportunity to interview you, to talk about the Mayfair's 90th anniversary. I mean, listeners, I know, of course, it's obvious this is an audio podcast, but if you guys get a chance, please Google the Mayfair Theater, Ottawa, Canada, because I know there's other Mayfair theaters around the country, and I think there's one in England. But if you guys get a chance, Google it. And I know that there's and me and Josh talked about it before we started the interview, but there's if you can find it, there's a 360-degree viewing of what the lobby looks like, and I believe inside the theater. Is that correct, Josh?
I think if you just go to Google Maps, you can select that option of walking right into the theater and clicking your way through it.
Because it's really great. Now, if you are a movie buff, and it's like Josh and Eric has said, if you're visiting Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, and if your schedule allows, please catch a movie at the Mayfair Theater. Again, I've seen pictures inside the theater, and as Eric has mentioned, it's like stepping back in time. I don't know how, for younger movie goers, I don't know how else to describe it, but just looking at the pictures of the Mayfair, it brought back memories of some of my independent theaters that are here in Hawaii. It's really awesome. So if you guys, again, listeners, if you're visiting, Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, please stop at the Mayfair Theater. So now also too, I want to thank Drew, the host of Comics for Fun and Profit, for putting this episode together. So Drew, thank you very much for all your hard work behind the scenes. And if you are a new listener, please check out new episodes of Comics for Fun and Profit that comes out every Saturday. And I want to thank you, the listeners. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for listening to this episode. And then if you guys get a chance, check out the movies that Eric and Josh had talked about, like, the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or I'm really putting this out there, Santa Claus Conquers the Martians. That is a pretty wild movie.
Classic.
It is. So until next time, guys, aloha.
Aloha.
Aloha.